From World Renew, the Office of Social Justice, and the Center for Public Dialogue of the Christian Reformed Church of North America, this is the Do Justice Podcast.
Well, hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Do Justice. My name is Chris Orm. I'm your host, and I'm extremely privileged today to have two very special guests. First, we have Leah Gazan, Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre, serving on the New Democratic Party. She's the critic for children, families, and social development, as well as deputy critic for immigration, refugees, and citizenship. Leah is a member of Wood Mountain Lakota Nation, located in Saskatchewan Treaty 4 territory. Leah, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we're doubly blessed today with two guests. We have Steve Heinrichs here. Steve identifies as a settler Christian from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory. He is the Director of Indigenous Settler Relations for Mennonite Church Canada. Steve is also the editor for the book Unsettling the Word, Biblical Experiments in Decolonization. Thanks, Steve, for being here.
It's great to be here.
Hey, and I have to be super upfront in these conversations. We were chatting before we started this episode, and I'm a bit of a fanboy of both of you. I've been following your work. Both of you have been, I would consider you teachers of mine, as I'm a fellow learner on this journey of reconciliation that we are in at the moment in Canada. And I want to just point out before we get too deep into the conversation that there's a potential here for conversations like these to be hypercharged. There are people who are waiting to be critical of how these kinds of conversations play out. And I think we're all aware of that, but it's important. And so for those of you who are joining us and you are beginning your reconciliation journey, or you're not quite sure where you are, our hope is that with this conversation that you would begin to get some of the tools to begin to take some of those steps, that you would begin to learn some of the avenues that you can take as a settler committed to reconciliation, and that maybe you'd be liberated from some of the fear that might bring some of that hesitancy. Like, what if I say the wrong thing? I'm not quite sure where to begin. We want to make this not easy, but we want to make this accessible. And so I think we have two amazing guests to help us do that today. So let's get started. How did you two meet? Because you come from two very different backgrounds, but how did you two meet and become friends? Leah, we'll start with you.
Well, I think, Steve always has a funny story about how we first met. I believe it was at the beginning of Idle No More. We met through a good fellow friend of ours, Negon Sinclair. I knew that Steve wanted an opportunity to talk with me. And I believe it was at a book launch. Was it at a book launch? Yes, it was, Steve. It was at a book launch. But I think Steve tells a really funny story. So, Steve approached me. He said, I'm Steve Heinrichs. I said, hello, Steve Heinrichs. And how did it go, Steve? I just love the way you tell the story.
Well, I think I mentioned that I was from the Mennonite community, and your eyes just went large because at the time you were teaching at University of Winnipeg in the education faculty, and you had a lot of Mennonites, white Mennonites, coming through your classes, white Mennonites that really didn't have much awareness of Indigenous settler relations, decolonization, basic reconciliation conversations. And so you saw me and grabbed me right away once I said Mennonite and said, you need to come with me. And you were introducing me to a bunch of your peers and colleagues. And I think that it opened up a space right away because you're saying, you know what, it seemed like here's a Mennonite who wants to do some work, engaging not only conversation around reconciliation, but white supremacy is at the root of the fracture. And so that started a relationship where you were inviting me into classes and we started getting to know each other and doing work on justice matters.
And I think it's important to point out within that context, like Indigenous peoples didn't put ourselves here. Right. And I don't believe that it's up to us to fix it. It's not up to us to fix our own colonial and ongoing colonial violence that we experience every day, including what just came out from the Premier's new Indigenous Affairs Minister, denying a residential school denier, talking about the benefits of residential school. That happened today in Manitoba, in the provincial government. And I think, it's not up to us to fix it, but it certainly, we are now all in it together, and we need to work together to seek justice for all. And at the forefront of that, I believe, if we're ever going to reconcile in this country, is certainly truth, recognizing truth, and not responding with discussion, but responding with action, as what was called for by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada.
Leah, I want to ask you to, if you could you name this moment, this cultural moment that we're in right now in the Canadian context? So some of our listeners, they're not Canadian. They might not even be tracking with what is going on. I think everyone in Canada, though, now is sort of in this space of at least, okay, what do we do? What is happening? What is this moment? And what is the significance of this moment?
Well, certainly we know the recovery of children around residential schools. We are faced with hard truths. We knew these truths in Canada. We knew these truths. They were actually part of the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. The fact that elected officials are talking about how they're shocked and surprised when this was already noted by the Truth and Reconciliation is very harmful. It's time for truth. What happened in Canada was genocide in residential school, and according and within the UN Convention on Genocide, and I'm going to read it. According to Article 2 of the UN Convention, it says, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. What happened in Canada was not cultural genocide. What happened in Canada was genocide. And the same sort of behavior that resulted in the deaths of thousands and thousands of children that never returned home to the families is all rooted in the same genocide, which is to forcibly remove us off our lands. And this is what we see in real time in the midst of a climate emergency. We saw that in Wet'suwet'en territory with LNG, armed, militarized RCMP forcibly removing Indigenous people off their lands at the end of a sniper gun. They're still trying to take off our lands. They took our children to try and assimilate us so that we would just become part of the Canadian economic agenda of the time. And they are still perpetrating the same sort of behavior today. In regards to residential schools, one only has to look at the child welfare system. There's more kids in care now than at the height of residential schools. If we are not willing to see truth in this country, if we are not willing to have those difficult discussions to finally acknowledge the truth, what happened in Canada was genocide. What continues to happen in Canada is ongoing genocide, as we see with murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and child welfare. It's going to be very hard for us to move forward towards reconciliation.
Yeah. And I think, just for our listeners too, like if you're unfamiliar with the 94 calls to action that Leah referenced, I think, a lot of people are throwing those around like, yeah, the 94 calls to action, the 94 calls to action, and then expressing that same level of shock and horror But when you can read the words from, I'll just read call to action number 75, if that's okay, right here. We call upon the federal government to work with provincial, territorial, and municipal governments, churches, Aboriginal communities, former residential school students, and current landowners to develop and implement strategies to proceed and procedures for the ongoing identification, documentation, maintenance, commemoration, and protection of residential school cemeteries or other sites at which residential school children were buried. This is to include the provision of appropriate memorial ceremonies and commemorative markers to honor the deceased children. There's no surprise here. This is from 6 years ago, so almost 7 years ago now. So there's no surprise. So yeah, thanks for giving shape to the context in which these conversations are happening. I so appreciate that. Steve, I want to ask you, you recently got back from the Unistoten camp. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is for folks who are unfamiliar?
Yeah, so Unistoten is a clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. Unistoten territory, one of their territories is about 66 kilometers south of Houston, BC. And since 2009, they've had a reoccupation of their territory. They're purposely opposing an energy corridor that the province and the federal government wants to put through there without their consent for a number of pipelines. Leah mentioned LNG pipeline, but also fossil fuel tar sands pipelines to go through there. And they're currently resisting the Coastal GasLink pipeline, 600 plus kilometers going out to the West Coast. And in that space, they're not simply resisting the pipeline because it is devastating for the territory. It makes no sense in an age of global heating that's going to impact not only the Unistoten and Wet'suwet'en, but peoples around the world. But they're resisting it because that space is sacred to them. That is their territory. They have jurisdiction there. They have lived there for millennia, and they are the rightful owners of that territory. And so people, Canada just affirmed legislatively to adopt or to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I know we'll talk about that a little later. The BC provincial government, more than a year ago, affirmed that they were going to implement the declaration. This goes against the basic principles, the minimum standards articulated in the declaration. And the Unistoten are saying, look, relational respect demands that you honor our jurisdiction here, our laws, our traditions, our spiritual connection, as Article 25 in the Declaration talks about, to the lands and territories and to the other than human creation that is in that space. So they're protecting it because they believe that the healing of the people is connected to the healing and protection of the land. And they're doing that first and foremost for their people, but they're also doing it for the rest of us, because global warming does not honor boundaries and jurisdictions like we might falsely imagine. On the day that I went up to Unistoten, it was the day that the news of the mass grave at Kamloops came out, May 28th, I think it was. The day that I left there, a month and a bit later, or the week that I left there, another hundreds of unmarked graves in Saskatchewan were made known to the public, and more graves this past week have come known. When I was sitting around table with the Indigenous leaders of the Unistoten and hearing them talk about their brilliant resistance, their perseverance, they made explicit the connections between the dispossession of children in their territory and the ongoing dispossession that's happening right now of their land. It's fundamentally connected. And it comes down to, like, if we truly see ourselves in equal relationship, we honor people's yes and no and consent. Children were taken away without consent. Land is currently being taken away without consent. Children were taken away because the government, and not only the government, and this is another point that we made to it. But Canadian society wanted access to the land. That's why children were taken. So I come to this conversation as a white settler and as a Christian. And the thing that I would want to just add to what Leah offered up is that the genocide that has been inflicted and that continues was explicitly done in the name of Jesus. Churches were at the helm of the fracture of Indigenous families, and it was done in the name of progress, of civilization, but in the name of Jesus, one whom I follow. So what is then the responsibility of church people like me when colonization was wrought in the name of Christ to do decolonization work? What is our role and responsibility in undoing or repairing harm that is unspeakable?
Yeah. I think a lot of us who are white settler Christian, we have found ourselves with new awareness, with the coverage of Wet'suwet'en and the Unistoten camp, with the land protectors pushing back against the oil companies trying to push this through, standing their ground against the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. We've seen that. I've seen powerful images come from there. Land Back Lane. And now, like you said, with the uncovering of graves at residential schools, there's this unsettling thing that is happening. And we know, I think, Steve, because I come at it from the same space as you. I come at it as a settler Christian follower of Jesus, and our audience would identify in that space as well. A lot of our audience are folks who are Christ followers. And so we come at these conversations a bit from a faith perspective. But it's my conviction, I think we know and we've seen in the past that that sort of jarring unsettledness can be used by the Creator to ignite something, to start something. I want to ask you, Leah, and I want you to respond to Steve, but in the midst of this sort of, finally some white settlers are opening their eyes. How have you seen people lean into this awareness that's been developed from these spotlighted moments in helpful ways?
Well, I just want to say, I had the privilege of working with Steve in the last Parliament to push forward a bill C-262 to see the full adoption and implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I spent a lot of time with people in the faith community who supported this call. Mm-hmm. So I think it's been a growing call within the faith community. I think it's important to recognize that for Indigenous peoples, whether they attended residential schools or intergenerational survivors, this is a very painful time.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for allies not to take up the emotional space. Mm-hmm. It's not our responsibility to make you feel better.
Right.
Oh, I'm sorry you're feeling bad about it. I know it's really painful. So I think people need to be cognizant of the emotional space mm-hmm. That they're taking up in the discussion. Somebody said to me the other day, for example, Leah, it's not just painful for Indigenous people. It's painful for all of us. I believe that. Mm-hmm. I believe that to be true. But, let's be clear about where we're taking up emotional space. If we want to be a good ally, we've had to spend, many of us, decades, years. For young people, they were born into intergenerational trauma their whole life, trying to work through this, including myself. I've had to spend, it's not up to us to make people feel better. Mm-hmm. We've been trying too hard to work through our own colonial trauma. I mean, this is real. It's one thing to feel badly, but that does nothing. You need to take action on that. So you say, I feel really badly. I've heard about this. It's very sad. This is what I'm going to do differently. This is how I'm going to contribute to real change going forward, to seek justice and reparations with Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples whose privilege I have benefited from, even to have a place to live, a piece of earth on which to reside on. How am I going to reconcile with that privilege? That's a difficult discussion, because what happens when you start talking about real solutions, and you have to have discussions about sharing privilege or giving up privilege. And that's the thing about white supremacy and misogyny. As soon as you start opening that discussion up, you start threatening your own privilege that has been born on the backs and continues to be born on the backs of genocide against Indigenous peoples in this country. Those are hard discussions.
Yeah.
Those are painful discussions, because then you begin to have to look at, how am I contributing to this current system? And that is hard. I want to honor that. That is hard, especially when the marginalization and human rights violations of Indigenous people by the current, by all governments in what some people call Canada now, has been born off the human rights violations of Indigenous people here in Canada and throughout the world in real time. I spoke to somebody the other day about mining in the Congo by Canadian mining companies. I've spoken to Indigenous brothers and sisters in Fiji talking about how Canadian mining companies benefit off the violation of Indigenous people residing in Fiji. We need to, if we want to reconcile in this country, then we have to be brutally truthful and honest. I think it's more and more people in Canada are ready to explore that truth and act on that truth, and have the power to push those, for example, in government, in opposition, to have the political will to never waver on the human rights of anybody, including Indigenous peoples.
Thank you for that. I think that's been a really big learning for me in this space as well. I'll just, not to take what you just said and then make it all about me, but I mean, I think I had some hang-ups about doing this interview, because I think I mentioned at the beginning, I didn't want to say something wrong. I didn't want to say something stupid or offensive, and I think that it was a friend of mine who actually said, "Oh, it's really cute, Chris. You don't even see that latent, misogyny and white supremacy that informs your practice of thinking that you are beyond correction and learning." And I was like, oh crap. Like, what? Okay. Yep. And these moments, have led to that. So thank you for touching on that. Steve, do you have anything that around that you found in some of your circles with these conversations that are starting? I think, kind of, springboarding off of what Leah just shared.
A couple thoughts come to mind, and I might be coming at this from a different angle, just to recognize that, like, for Indigenous peoples, these epochal moments, these revelatory moments are happening continually, like on an annual basis. Like, this is huge, what's going on right now. But we have had Wet'suwet'en, last year, the year before. We've had Mi'kmaq fishers and the white racism out on the East Coast. We've had Oka, Gustavson Lake. You can go through each period of time and say, these are the moments, and like, when will white society, when will white church step up? We had Black Lives Matter last year, and how many people were like doing individual acts or institutional commitments to do something. Where are they now in this moment? So just to recognize that the voices calling us to change and action are always present with us. And I think what we need to do right now is take some very intentional steps to build into our lives, the opportunity for change making, for action to happen. And I think, that means a lot of us folks linking up with a local group so that we have people who we can walk with and we can learn from. We can have those bruising but persistent relationships that can help us transform, so that we're committed to this. Because I say this in sincerity, like, here's to push back against the kind of reconciliation work that I do. Like, a lot of it is educational. A lot of it is like book clubs, like in response to things that are happening. And people say, like, what material change actually comes from what you're doing there? Yeah. Last year, when Black Lives Matter happened, there was an article that came out, Washington Post, that says, when Black people march in the streets, crying out in anger and movement, white people form a book club. Like, what change flows from that? So I think there are people that are taking those intentional steps. I think the key is to link arms with others. I'll highlight one example. There's a group in Southern Ontario in response to 1492 Land Back Lane, a reoccupation of traditional Haudenosaunee lands, resisting a development project there. A group formed called Clergy and Laity in support of 1492 Land Back Lane. They've been doing basic kind of educational group work. A lot of white people from different communities helping each other do that work of learning, but they've been providing tangible support to the reoccupation there, meals and so on. You can do it with others. On your own, it's so hard to really stick with it. I don't think we're meant to do it on our own. So we got to link arms.
Yeah, I love that. Had a mentor one time that said to me, like the old adage, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, and with as many friends as possible. It's a lot easier that way. Yeah. Yeah. Leah, let's talk about political change. We know that the injustices that Indigenous people have faced and continue to face are systemic. So let's talk a little bit about systemic solutions. You just shared with us, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the adoption of that bill that you put forward, that it's passed in Canadian Parliament. And we have the 94 calls to action, and we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the report. But there is a nuance between passing legislation and then enacting. It's one thing to check the box on that regard, but what does it look like to actually begin to enact this legislation?
Well, that's a great question. I don't suspect, certainly as somebody who sat in that house for a couple of years already as a new MP, sat in the house and then sometimes remotely because of the pandemic. I don't think the behavior of colonial governments will change. I think they will continue, as we have witnessed even out in BC. They will continue to willfully and knowingly and intentionally violate the rights of Indigenous peoples. What it does provide us is another legislative tool, another legal tool to fight for our rights. We know there's over 200 Supreme Court rulings, that have ruled in favor of Indigenous peoples, the Supreme Court, in recent history. We know that. I don't suspect behavior is going to change. I think it will take critical mass, movement building. When I ran for office, I'm a long time a grassroots person. I ran with the belief that I would continue to work with boots to ground and bring that voice on the inside. That's how, we got Bill C-262, for example, to pass through Parliament to be killed in the Senate. That's how C-15 ended up passing. We are at a critical juncture. In the past year, we have, since just being elected, we had a national shutdown in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en peoples defending their right. in Wet'suwet'en territory in opposition to the LNG pipeline, bulldozing people who have been on their land since time immemorial. Solidarity, beautiful. To going into a global pandemic that highlighted, gross inequalities and equities that were there prior to the pandemic that have only been made worse by the pandemic. The truth is coming out in droves. To now finding, recovering what we already knew, but many people chose to turn a blind eye. Beautiful, sacred lives, family members recovering and repatriating and bringing our children home. And the ocean recently on fire and heat waves in even the city of Winnipeg, where we're looking at weather, 35-degree weather. The climate emergency kills people. It kills the Mother Earth. It kills people. It kills animals. It kills water life. We are at a critical juncture. Mm-hmm. And we can't leave it up to those in power. We need a movement. Yeah. We need to continue building the movement to push those who can change laws, make decisions, such as myself, to be forced into doing the right thing. Because if people made the right choices, we would have never had the Indian Act. Right. We would have never been in the climate emergency. We wouldn't be having debates about cutting down the last 3% of the old growth in the midst of a climate emergency as we watch our beautiful mother burning. Mm. We need a movement. Yeah. And I think going back full circle, Steve, with me, in our differences, coming together, we have come together in building, participating in movement building to try and move forward a better world for all in respect of our beautiful mother.
Final question. Steve, I'll ask you, and then I'll ask you, Leah. So we've talked about action. We've used that word a few times. What's the first step for someone who is wanting to act? What's step one? Where do they begin this journey?
I think step one is know the place that you are living, know whose land you are on, know not only the past but the present stories of the people. And as you're doing that work, you seek to find ways to, with deep respect, to link up, to get to know those people in the flesh. And then step 2 and 3 and 4 is start to support the struggles of the people where you live.
Yeah. And Leah, from you, like what would you say? Same question. Like where do we begin?
Well, I think we need to redefine action. I've been saying this in a lot of places. Just act. And there's different ways to act. You can, run rallies and speak at rallies. That's one action, but you can also write. Some people acted when we walked for Bill C-262, walking. Learning is an action. Listening is an action. Writing petitions is an action. Going on the front lines, much like my brother Steve does, is an action. I just think it's time that we have to act because we are running out of time. We don't have a lot of time. It was calls to justice in the National Inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. It was calls to action in the TRC. It wasn't calls to discussion. Mm-hmm. And we are running out of time. I think it is a time to really position ourselves where we are in part of this struggle, and act accordingly. Mm.
Thank you both. Our guests today have been Leah Gazan Steve Heinrichs. We'll give you some information in the description of this episode to find out how you can track with the work that they're doing. We'll also give you some information on ways that you can start to get involved, as well as some resources for learning, so that you can be informed about how you act. I'm thankful for both of you. I'm so thankful that you both took the time to be here. We'll continue to track with you and hopefully talk again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And I'd say follow Leah on Twitter. She'll give you leads.
Oh yeah, she's a great follow. She's a great follow, everybody.
What is my here? I'm going to give you can I give you my Twitter? Handle.
Yes.
I'm told to do this, and then I say, what is my Twitter handle? What is I always forget. So on Instagram, it's Leah Gazan MP, and on Facebook, and I believe on Twitter, I'm going to get the right handle this time. Last time I gave the wrong ones. It is at Leah Gazan. So it's Leah Gazan MP on Instagram and Facebook, and Leah Gazan on Twitter.
Thanks again so much.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Take care.
The Do Justice podcast is produced and edited by World Renew in partnership with the Office of Social Justice and Center for Public Dialogue of the Christian Reformed Church of North America. Our opening theme was written by Quetzalcoatl. Transitions provided by Valentin Sosnitsky. Until next time, remember that the Lord is righteous, He loves justice, and the upright will see His face.